Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating journey of how information actually travels from the real world straight into your brain. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the mechanics of communication theory. Now, if you've ever wondered how new technologies or ideas spread through societies, a process formerly studied as the diffusion of innovation theory, well, you first have to understand the obstacles those innovations face. Think about it. An incredible new innovation absolutely cannot diffuse through society if media gatekeepers block it from the press, or, if individual psychological filters just reject it. So, to really grasp how ideas spread, we're going to look closely at two major forces controlling the flow of information today: gatekeeping theory and selectivity theory. With literally millions of events happening around the globe every single day, we have to ask, why do you only hear about a select few? The reality you consume isn't a direct reflection of the world, right? It's a highly curated selection of events. But who's doing the curating? Who is holding the keys to the information gate? To answer that, here is our roadmap for today. 1. The daily information filter. 2. Origins of gatekeeping theory. 3. Criteria for news selectivity. 4. Audience gatekeeping in Web 2.0. And finally, 5. Your mind's selective filters. We're going to follow a single piece of information all the way down the funnel.
Section 1. The daily information filter.
A gatekeeper is simply an individual, or maybe an institution, responsible for determining what can pass through various communication channels. They stall some information while deliberately letting other stories through. This happens at multiple levels. It could be a reporter deciding which specific sources to interview, an editor picking which stories make the front page, or a media owner pushing a specific agenda. The gatekeeper functions as the ultimate decision maker. To tie this back to the diffusion of innovation, imagine an incredible, life-saving medical innovation is discovered. If a media owner decides that story just doesn't fit their network's current focus, the gate closes. The diffusion of that innovation stalls immediately, simply because the gatekeeper didn't let the information through.
Section 2. Origins of gatekeeping theory.
If we trace the evolution of this academic theory across the decades, we see a massive shift from physical food chains to digital news feeds. It begins with Kurt Lewin in the mid-20th century, moves into traditional print journalism with David Manning White, gets modernized by researchers like Pamela Shoemaker, and eventually crashes headfirst into the internet age. Let's look closer at those origins because they are deeply insightful. Kurt Lewin, a German psychologist, first used the term gatekeeping to describe how food travels from a garden to the family dinner table. He noted that the wife or mother typically controlled the gates, deciding what food actually made it to the plates of her family based on preferences, budgets, and constraints. Well, Lewin's highly relatable dinner table analogy was adapted by David Manning White in 1949. White studied a wire editor whom he famously called Mr. Gates, proving that an editor acts exactly like that mother. Mr. Gates was highly selective in his rejections and approvals of news stories. It was a total revelation at the time to realize that global news was subject to the same personal, highly subjective filtering as a family dinner menu.
Section 3. Criteria for news selectivity.
So how do these institutional gatekeepers actually choose what gets approved? Doris Graber, in her foundational work on mass media, outlined 5 strict criteria that dictate this process. Let's take a second to really absorb these. First, strong impact. Journalists actively reframe distant, complex crises into highly relatable, everyday scenarios for you. If it doesn't impact your daily life, it usually gets cut. Second, conflict or disaster. Stories involving violence or scandal consistently outperform neutral events. Third, familiarity. We naturally gravitate towards celebrities and public figures we already know rather than strangers, so editors prioritize familiar faces. Fourth, proximity. Audiences vastly prefer local, nearby news. And fifth, time and novelty. The event must be unique or out of the ordinary. Graber basically established that journalists actively look for these exact triggers when filtering the world's events for you.
Fast forward to 2001. Researchers Pam Shoemaker and her colleagues wanted to test these criteria in modern politics. They studied congressional bills, proving that strict, objective newsworthiness strongly outweighed a journalist's personal characteristics when granting coverage. They discovered that when evaluating what bills got reported on, the subjective traits of the reporters didn't matter nearly as much as the sheer news value of the event itself, based on criteria similar to Graber's.
But as you can probably guess, the traditional newspaper gates we just discussed couldn't hold up forever. They began to crumble with the rise of the internet. Jane Singer famously studied the 2000 and 2004 presidential elections and realized that the web radically questioned the long-held belief that traditional journalists could, or even should, restrict what is disseminated to the public.
Section 4. Audience gatekeeping in Web 2.0.
With the emergence of Web 2.0, researchers introduced the concept of audience gatekeeping. Instead of creating news, your role on platforms like Twitter and Facebook is to filter and share existing content based on your own criteria. You have become the editor. You decide what your network sees. This is where the diffusion of innovation theory really kicks into overdrive. In the Web 2.0 era, the audience actively accelerates the diffusion of innovations. You are the one deciding if a new tech gadget or a social movement goes viral within your community, based entirely on what you choose to hit the share button on.
If we walk through the transition from traditional to digital, we see a complete paradigm shift. We move from top-down distribution conducted by media institutions and guided by strict routines, all the way over to peer-to-peer sharing conducted by everyday users and guided entirely by personal interests. Research by Kwan and others in 2013 showed that user-reprocessed news is actually shared more frequently on Twitter than direct mass media links. That makes you the new digital gatekeeper. You're taking the narratives shaped by traditional institutions and reshaping, filtering, and redistributing them to your communities.
Section 5. Your mind's selective filters. Even after a story navigates the media gates and the social media audience gates, it still faces the toughest filter of all, your own mind. Welcome to selectivity theory. At the widest part of your psychological funnel, you actively seek out perspectives you already agree with to reinforce your existing worldviews. This is called selective exposure. People utilize media not necessarily to learn new facts, but to find perspectives they anticipate will resonate with their own views. Think about how people curate their social feeds today. They often only follow politicians or influencers they already agree with, actively walling off opposing views. And honestly, if they do explore opposing viewpoints, it's usually just so they can figure out how to counter-argue them later.
Now, if opposing information does somehow slip through your exposure filter, you apply selective perception. The famous Mr. Bigot experiments are a classic illustration of this, and they're absolutely fascinating. In those experiments, researchers showed anti-prejudice propaganda to prejudiced individuals. The propaganda was specifically designed to make prejudice look completely ridiculous, but the prejudiced subjects applied selective perception. They completely missed the sarcasm. They twisted the meaning of the message so much that they actually thought the propaganda was agreeing with them. We hear what we wish to hear. The exact same piece of information can convey totally different meanings to people of different backgrounds.
At the very bottom of the funnel, we find selective retention. Researchers Melvin DeFleur and Sandra Ball-Rokic concluded that from the vast array of available content, you will selectively attend to, interpret, and then retain only the messages that support your values. You'll unconsciously forget the news that doesn't support your views, retaining only what comforts you. To bring it all back to the diffusion of innovation one last time, if an incredible new innovation fundamentally challenges someone's deep-rooted worldview, selective retention guarantees they'll simply forget about it. The diffusion stops dead in its tracks. This incredibly strong psychological gate greatly diminishes the likelihood that media can actually alter someone's deep-rooted attitudes.
We've traveled from the newsroom editor's desk right down to the neurons in your brain, since you are the ultimate gatekeeper of your own reality, both online and in your own memory. I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Take a look at your own newsfeed and ask yourself, what information are you letting through the gate, and what truths is your mind actively filtering out today? Keep that in mind next time you scroll. And thanks for joining me for this explainer.